nuclear family remains, still central to capitalism today in terms of reproducing the next generation of workers. And the ideology of the nuclear family remains incredibly resilient. I mean, I don't know about anyone else. I was quite excited by the new series of Married at First Sight coming out soon, where essentially, they match people up on mainstream TV. They match people up who've never seen one another. They get married and they're told to make it work. And this is still this marriage being kind of portrayed as in some way, or a stable stable kind of quite heteronormative, monogamous relationship as the norm and the thing to aspire to. So that ideology is still incredibly resilient, I think. And just the last thing that I want to touch on is in terms of how do we try and fight that? And I think if oppression is rooted in the nuclear family, if oppression is rooted within the capitalist system, therefore it means that we have to look to the power, what social force has the power to actually smash that system that causes our oppression. And that's why socialists bang on about the working class. It's not because working class people are automatically more progressive. It's not because they're more socialist or because many working class people, don't have bigoted ideas. That's all true. It's because objectively within capitalism, working class people are the ones that make the profits. Without them, the system couldn't run. And therefore, looking towards the working class as a way of smashing that system is crucial. That doesn't mean that you just focus about wages or economic conditions. As revolutionaries, we have to win working class people who are not LGBT plus, away from bigoted ideas and to fighting for liberation as well. And having that kind of radical vision of saying we need to actually smash that whole system, I think is one that it kind of runs through what we're trying to do with the pamphlet, and to reclaim that radical history of an anti-system kind of fight, which has been slightly lost from mainstream LGBT plus politics, but also say the best way of fighting that system is by looking to working class people transforming that whole society, because we can have a society that is based on human liberation and not exploitation and oppression, but that means getting rid of capitalism.
Thank you very much, Tomáš. And sorry, I forgot earlier to actually introduce myself. Sorry, everyone. Hi, I'm Pat. I'm a member here in Manchester, and a performer and a queer activist here. To bring in our next speaker, Skye, who is a student activist in Liverpool. So, Skye, you've got 8 to 10 minutes. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Tomáš. I really enjoyed what you were saying. I'm going to touch a little bit on what Tomáš said, but I'm going to also go into depth of other things. So as we're all aware, right now, capitalism is in disaster. We're seeing a triple crisis happen simultaneously. We can see the crisis of coronavirus, an economic crisis alongside this. And then in the background, looming terrifyingly is the climate crisis. All of this in combination being a ticking clock of the catastrophe. With this disaster, we're seeing the ruling class fall back more heavily upon its classic tactic of divide and conquer, a means to which the ruling class divides the working class along the grounds of race, gender, sexuality, and many more. We can see this currently with the rise in ideological attacks, specifically upon transgender community, with the Tory party recently tragically ruling to strip back rights of young trans workers in early December, with the High Court ruling to ban under 18-year-old transgender people from accessing life-saving puberty drugs. Drugs, in actual fact, that I'm currently on, and I got them when I was 18, and I would be dead without them. I'm going to be really honest. So with this, we're also seeing a massive rise in far-right and fascist activities against all minority groups, but specifically we've seen against LGBT plus people, which trends alongside the massive increase in LGBT plus hate crime. Notably, one that I remember is the horrific act against 2 women on a bus in late 2019. I'm sure some of us remember that. And I know after I heard it, I didn't feel safe in public for a long time. Our essential gender identity services, which provide life-saving care for trans and non-binary people, previously before COVID had a 3-year waiting list. And I can only imagine they've gotten longer with all the resources being directed into COVID-19 related care. Although this isn't an isolated case within the NHS. It shows quite clearly the government's position to leave vulnerable trans people, especially trans people out in the wild, left to fend for themselves, with basically no support provided by the state. This has left a reliance on non-LGBT plus specific charities, which bluntly aren't trained to deal with specific issues. And then it's also left a reliance on LGBT specific charities, from which my experience before COVID were running at near capacity. It's no wonder that the LGBT plus suicide rate, specifically the trans rates of attempted suicide, are so high. Tragically, in 2020, we also heard that around 350 trans and non-binary people were murdered across the world, which is the highest we've had since records began. I'm sorry to call the mood, we shouted from the roofs of every Capitol building across the world. But we also must recognise gains we've seen for LGBT plus liberation across the world, including resistance on our own doorsteps in Manchester, with the massive transgender pride demonstration we saw, which merged with a BLM demonstration using the banner of Black Trans Lives Matter. We've also seen Joe Biden's first day of office. He signed a sweeping executive order in that protects LGBT plus people in many realms of American life. Does this mean that LGBT plus oppression, is over in America? No, but it is a reform that will countlessly make lives easier for them there. However, we all know that reforms can only go so far. They're temporary and they're subject to attack, as we've seen throughout history. So we believe that LGBT oppression isn't inherent and it can be ended, as Thomas said, and that the pamphlet discusses its origins and its ties to capitalism. And we believe to fight something, you must first know where it comes from, because we know that with all wounds, you can put a plaster over an open wound, but that won't solve it. You have to stitch it up and you have to wipe it clean. And we know that sexual liberation can be achieved, and we can live in a society where LGBT plus oppression doesn't exist. I wanted to talk specifically in the introduction of more common LGBT plus oppression in society, which was backed up by the ruling class during the Industrial Revolution. Engels set out in one of his works, The Origin of the Family, the formation of family during the beginning of class society. And with the advent of new productive methods, people were moving into cities where they previously would have been growing up in community-led spaces. Children were growing up aided not always by their biological parents, but instead by their community. And with this movement out of communities into slums of big cities, we'd see what we recognise now as the family. The ruling class needed workers, and it needed a lot of them to keep up with the ever-increasing demands of industrial capitalism as the world really started to grow. This was aided tragically by high mortality rate and low life expectancies of workers who were working in beyond poor conditions under machines, in mines, all to aid the increasing bank accounts of the ruling classes. With an ever-growing need for workers to be replaced, but they all got massacred in these deadly environments, the family unit shifted into its own productive force, the production of babies, really, which was aided by the church and legislation. And unlike before, sex was deemed more to be as a procreative measure rather than as one of love, I suppose. When we see like the starting of the clampdown of non-heterosexual relationships, we see this through the necessity of specifically gay women in societies like this to the force of them to get married into heterosexual relationships, as they couldn't work for the same wages of men, and then they wouldn't be able to sustain themselves without a quote male breadwinner in their lives. Fundamentally, this gave gay women two choices: either heterosexual marriage or the workhouse. And this emphasis was also seen in the family unit itself, which, without the welfare state, which came in much later, relied on the children, not only to make money to sustain their households, but then also to look after parents when they became too old to continue working. And this therefore forced all people into the specifically family unit, which resolved around, as I said, the production of children to remain sustainable and give parents even, honestly, the faintest possibility of a better life when they finished working. Alongside we see this more social push into the family. We also see it backed up by legislation used by the ruling class to enforce this, such as things like the Buggery Act, the Labour Amendments, and the Factory Act of 1840, the latter being used to block women from certain workplaces, specifically factories. like I said earlier, making it harder for women to sustain themselves on their own. We see the state clamp down strongly against those who are a threat to the family. We see this through the trial of Oscar Wilde, among others. And we see this alongside the creation itself of the word homosexual, which hadn't existed up till this point. We see this throughout history, with the NHS taking a role in this, as we see by the unfortunate death of Alan Turing when he was criminalized and chemically castrated in an NHS facility, and then ultimately took his life due to this. We can see that the state took a very hard line against LGBT plus people throughout history, not even granting exceptions to people who they will have called a war hero. You might ask the question why I'm only focusing on the United Kingdom. Well, obviously, homophobia and transphobia also exists across the world. We conclude that throughout this intense period of oppression, the ideas of the ruling class were being exported abroad through imperialism in places which previously would have had more sexual and gender liberation, as seen by the missionaries who went there. We see this be put through imperialism and then backed up by the genocide of people in those areas, unfortunately. We can see that capitalism is part of the root cause of LGBT oppression, and it'll take a complete restructuring of society, socially and economically, away from capitalism, that will lead to the true sexual and gender liberation, as we got a glimpse of in the first few months of the Russian Revolution. And I think it's our job as socialists to dream bigger and to face all oppressions as we see it today. Thank you.
As part of researching kind of the pamphlet and the talk, I came across something Carl Whitman, who was one of the founders of the Gay Liberation Front in the US. One of the things he said, and at the time he wrote, "We know we are radical in that we know the system that we're under now is a direct source of oppression. And it is not a question of getting an equal share of the pie because the pie is rotten." And I think that's such a powerful sort of way of saying it, because it's not just about trying to win equality under capitalism, although of course those kind of fights for greater legal equality are important. It's not just about trying to have more LGBT plus people within the ruling class or the establishment. That's the kind of Biden strategy, the sort of, when he won, I thought, we're going to have to get those intersectional imperialism memes out again, because, that his vision is, well, let's be a bit more diverse, a bit more inclusive, but do nothing with the system that actually is the source of that oppression. So I think that's a really important thing to kind of to flow through our kind of discussions around this. And I think locating oppression within capitalism and with looking at the importance of the family, which Skye and other people have talked about, is really important for locating where that oppression is. But also, one of the biggest issues at the minute is trans and the fight for to make trans lives matter. Now, if you think about some people on the left who have a really awful transphobic to varying to transcritical sort of positions on this, it's because they see male violence, they see that as somehow inherently rooted in biology. It's kind of like a biological deterministic argument. And therefore, that leads them to say, well, therefore, trans women, because they haven't experienced women's oppression for the whole of their lives, therefore, they're also prone to violence. Well, that's an essentialist view, which sees oppression rooted in biology. Our kind of Marxist understanding of rooting oppression within class society, with seeing the importance of the institution of the family in terms of shaping oppression, reinforcing it, is actually really important in terms of going against that kind of gender essentialist kind of argument that people come up against. So, I mean, I didn't have time to go through that in the talk, but that's some of the things that we do talk about in the pamphlets. I think, the reason why that kind of Marxist analysis is important is because it really is about, what is the source of this oppression? And it's really important to go against those kind of crap arguments that people come up against. Just the last thing, I mean, there was the other thing I wanted to talk about was, people mentioned this kind of idea around class unity and the working class. And I think we have to be careful how we argue this, because it's not the case that we say oppression is rooted within capitalism, therefore you just have to fight on so-called working class issues and economic issues, and just fight against the system, forget the fight against, you know, sexism and LGBT oppression in the here and now. That's not kind of that's not the argument. We have to take up any kind of any instance of oppression, whether it happens to a working class person or a ruling class person and so on, in the here and now. But it's about recognizing where that oppression flows from, and also what's the force that can destroy the system that that leads to that oppression in the first place. I'm just kind of, I know I mentioned it in the beginning, but I do want to emphasize, it's not about saying that working class people are all lovely or don't have homophobic views. And our job as revolutionaries, not just LGBT comrades, everyone, is to win an argument for working class unity, break people from those kind of bigoted ideas, and win them to a struggle for a liberated sort of society. And therefore, that means encouraging a much bigger working class fight back. But within that, it means challenging any of those kind of ideas and saying we need to fight against all oppression as well. Because, you know, oppression is something that cuts across class. There are ruling class people who are Black, there are ruling class people who are LGBT plus, who abhor homophobia, may abhor transphobia because they think it's a bad thing, but they do benefit, but they do ultimately benefit from a system which perpetuates it. So we have to fight against that whole system, because that system commodifies our sexuality, represses and distorts it. And what we need to do is fight for that society where it's not just where we aren't alienated in that same way. And that means, and that does mean coming back to that idea of getting rid of capitalism. And I think that is quite a radical argument to have. You know, the common sense is that it comes from oppression, comes from bad ideas and so on, or it's natural to society. And we have to say, you know what, it's not natural. And that's really radical, because that means we can live without it.